your side, because I can go from kind of crazy sciencey stuff to sort of just general discussions. So wasn't too sure what you guys would have an interest in. So my topic would be looking at the health risks that are associated with GMOs and really understanding where the health dangers and risks lie. Not really from a kind of perspective of speculation, but understanding the physiology and how the GMO and of course the fallout in terms of the overuse of the glyphosate, how that really impacts on the body. So does that sound like something you guys are interested in? I guess you all know what GMOs are and all of that stuff. Any skeptics in the room? GMOs are good things. They're going to save the world, and we can all starve if we don't have genetically modified crops. Anyone believe that? No. If you do, it's okay. I was hoping there'd be someone just to keep me on my toes. But yeah, we have a fairly strong pro-GMO influence at the varsity here. So the debate rages. I thought I'll throw this slide up. It's a wonderful article to get. It's downloadable. You can get it in a PDF. It's an open source, written by Nicholas Taleb. And Nicholas Taleb wrote a book called Anti-Fragile. His actual qualifications and his speciality is risk assessment. So he looks at complex systems and he assesses risk, whether it's in a financial system, the banking system, the food system, etc. They use very, very in-depth statistical and actuarial data and manipulation of data to try and get a sense of what are the risks in the systems that we find ourselves interacting with. So he wrote the book Anti-Fragile, and he wrote this paper looking at genetically modified organisms and the risks associated. It's a fantastic read if you ever want to really come to some kind of grips with why we should be worried. And it's a good one to send to people who don't think you should be worried. I work from something which is called a functional medicine perspective. So functional medicine is a systems biology take on medicine. And from a functional medicine perspective, although in medicine we're interested in these organ systems. You know, if you have a brain tumor, you go to a brain surgeon. If you've got a kidney problem, you go to a nephrologist. You've got a hormone problem, you go to an endocrinologist. The subspecialities and specialities, this kind of separating the different systems from each other. And functional medicine says, well, that's fine, but that's like the leaves of the tree. The organ system diseases are a downstream thing. What's happening upstream? And another way to look at it, it's the leaves of the tree, the trunk of the tree is the signs and symptoms, the things that we see, but below the surface are the real functions that are going out of balance. And there are these essentially 8 core functions. I don't really care what diseases people have, but I'm interested in what functional systems are breaking down. If you correct the functional system, the disease goes away, no matter what its name is, because the disease is rooted in functional disarray. Functional systems are falling apart. So when I look at GMOs from a health perspective, I'm not going to say, well, it does this to your heart, and it does this to your brain, and etc. I'm going to look at what does it do to the functioning of the very core systems that are actually making your biology work. And when we look at all this, assimilation is you assimilating, processing, digesting your nutrients. Defense and repair is your immune system. Excuse me. Energy is your body making the cellular energy in order to drive all the processes. Transport is pretty much what it says, carrying things around. Biotransformation is your detoxification, getting rid of stuff you don't want. Communication, everybody's talking to each other, and then structural integrity, keeping all the membranes and the bones and the ligaments, etc., in a good kind of condition so that you don't fall down. So those are the core functions that we're needing to live a good, healthy life. And those are all impacted by these. So these, when things go wrong here, put stress on these systems. So there are always the antecedents, your genetic stuff, the triggers, things that happen in your life, and then the mediators, continuing stress here that then upsets this. You have signs and symptoms, you have an organ system disease, you go to your doctor who tries to adjust your hormones with medication from the outside, when actually the problem's coming in here. And of course we're interested in this one when we talk about GMOs. So this will just give you an idea of how I think about things. And it's interesting that we talk about the roots of the trees, the condition of the soil, and the soil microbiome is what our health and our well-being is built on to a large degree. It's one of the roots of our health, that the soil is correct, that the plants that come from the soil, the animals that feed off the soil are getting what they need. That sustains us in terms of life. So I think the analogy of the tree with roots is actually a bit more apt than one would imagine. And we often look, in looking at somebody, kind of identify problems in these areas. So when I talk about GMOs and health, I'm going to actually talk about how these different systems get broken down one way or the other, or some of the systems more than others. The two problems we have is the GMOs themselves, and of course the collateral damage that is coming into play as a result of the genetic modification because of the way that it's done. It's done in a very old-fashioned way, given the way that human systems and biological systems work. And then the glyphosate and the glyphosate-like herbicides, which many of the genetically modified plants are resistant to. So then you can overspray them with a particular herbicide, kill all the weeds, but of course the plants are now literally doused with and over-concentrated with a particular herbicide. And Roundup is the big one. So you guys familiar with Roundup? You know what Roundup is? Okay, it's that when you see the guys from the municipality on the side of the road and they're spraying, and the next day everything is kind of yellow, chances are that was Roundup. That just kills everything. Kills everything very effectively. The genetically modified plants are resistant to it, so they can take that stress, but unfortunately the Roundup damages the soil, it damages all the other plants, it damages the microbes, so we'll talk a little bit about that. So there's a lot of fallout when it comes to that side of things. So those are the two problems. Genetic engineering in and of itself is based on very old ways of thinking about genes. So when I was at medical school, which is a long time ago, you had this idea that one gene encoded for one trait, one thing. You had a gene for this and a gene for that and a gene for something else. And that's a very old way of looking at things. The GMO process still says we want to take a gene and put it into another organism, and that gene encodes for this, and we want that organism to have this characteristic. So we're going to take a gene from somewhere else, fit it into another organism, and bring that trait into this organism. And that was acceptable when we were experimenting with genetics, when we still didn't know. Now we know that actually genes are three-dimensional structures that communicate with each other. You can't tamper with one gene and not affect all the other genes. So the genetic structure is not a two-dimensional structure. It's a three-dimensional structure. It has a vibrationary nature. It's flexible, and all the genes bounce information off each other. So it's quite alive in a sense. And so when you tamper with one gene, it ricochets throughout the whole genetic code, so to speak. And that has not been taken into account in any real way. So nowadays, the sort of the genetic, or the genetic treatments or working at switching genes on or off, the scientists and researchers who do that, they look for particular entry points in the sequence that are safe, that you can actually then splice information in and turn genes on and off. And it's called, the acronym is CRISPR. And you can literally turn off the hemophilia gene, which is the one where people bleed. They have a problem with a clotting factor. So they have that bleeding disorder. You can turn off specific genes, but you've hit the right entry point, and it's very specific. The GMO process is nowhere close to that. If it was close to that, we wouldn't have some of the problems that we have at the moment. So essentially this whole process in terms of genetic engineering is you isolate a gene with a desired trait, you change the genes that will work in a plant or in a bacteria, you prepare the plant cells or the tissues, and you shoot that gene into these plant cells. You force them in under it's essentially high pressure. Or you can get a bacteria to carry them, and then you regrow those cells in tissue culture, and you find the ones that have got the genetic characteristics that you need. And that's the assumption that this one gene is only going to do this in that plant, and that is fundamentally not the way that genetics works anymore. So genetics has come a long way since the powers that be, Monsanto, etc., started doing this GMO process with all sorts of things, including our food. And the question we want to ask ourselves in terms of this whole process is, if we now have a different picture of genetics and the repercussions of this kind of methodology, should we not be reconsidering any of the GMOs that are out there? Because, again, we're using the flawed science, very archaic science, in a sense, to create the genetically modified organisms that we're then inviting people to eat. So that's one of the challenges that we have. And so when you change one gene, you have this blowback effect and the rest of the genome, and you can't predict what the fallout is going to be. The fallout has been in plants that the plants lose their resistance to very, very weak viruses. The fallout in animals is a secondary fallout. You eat those plants or those feeds that are genetically modified, is that their resistance breaks down because of unseen and unknown effects. So the crops, genetically modified crops, have a tendency to fail big time, especially when they encounter particular viruses or particular fungi that they would have been easily resistant to in the past. They now lose that resistance because other things have been tampered with that weren't evident and weren't considered. So, again, Nicholas Taleb in that article says we're using naive engineering strategies in a very complex environment. And now we understand the complexity of the environment. But we're not saying, wait a minute, it's like someone insists on using an archaic means of transport when you've actually got, much more efficient and effective means of transport. It's kind of be like the electric car in a few decades' time, and someone's still going to insist on their diesel bucky. And you say, but there's an electric car, what's wrong with you? So it's this kind of thinking. So I think, again, when we look at genetically modified organisms, you want to insert a gene with a certain trait, and because that gene has never been part and parcel of the organism that it's going to be inserted in, you generally have to find an on switch. You've got to tag an on switch onto it because that organism has never had that gene before, so it doesn't actually have the switch for it. Because genes need to be switched on and off to actually manifest and work. So invariably, all the GMO, whether it's whatever products come from any genetically modified organisms, in general, the on switch is some kind of virus, which will then kickstart that gene once it's in its new home. Does that make sense? Okay, it's going to kickstart the gene. You also need to put some kind of a stop signal in there, because otherwise this gene will just go crazy, and it'll probably be something very similar to cancer, where again the cells are not stopping in terms of dividing, they're just carrying on growing, so their off switch isn't operating as it should. So there are these excuse me, interesting on switches, which are often viruses or bacteria, and then stop signals, which you can find from another gene that might lend itself well to to this particular trait, and it turns that gene off, and it'll turn this trait off, so off we go. And we have problems here because many of the genetically modified products have got built into them some kind of virus. And unfortunately, in the long term, that virus is going to cause a weakening in that organism in and of itself. Viruses also, we know, are very adaptable. So that virus could also result in certain forms of, not really resistance, but cross-reaction with other viruses. And it can start to turn other viruses on and amplify them in a certain way. So what is often the result is that certain viruses that were weak in a population now become extremely virulent. And there's a lot of talk about the Zika virus. Any of you heard the whole sort of thing around the Zika virus, and why is this very, very, very weak virus suddenly expressing itself with these disastrous health issues, the microcephaly, etc. And there's a very strong suspicion that the communities that are the most affected by the Zika are communities that are in some way downstream to a lot of the glyphosate from genetically modified fields and farms, other kinds of neurotoxins, and possibly they've been exposed to a lot of GMOs. So viruses are now manifesting characteristics and strengths that they never had